In the scorching desert of southern Utah, on a September morning in 1857, the unthinkable happened. A white flag of truce was raised over a besieged wagon train, promising safe passage to 137 men, women, and children who had been under attack for 5 brutal days. What followed next would become one of the most shocking betrayals in American history, when those offering salvation became executioners and fellow settlers turned into cold-blooded killers. The victims weren't foreign invaders or hostile warriors. They were American families traveling from Arkansas to California in search of new opportunities. Their killers weren't savage enemies from a distant land. They were members of a religious community, men who attended church on Sundays and claimed to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. This is the story of the Meadows Massacre, a tale so disturbing that it would be covered up, denied, and lied about for over 150 years. To understand how such horror could unfold in the American frontier, we must first journey back to the turbulent origins of one of America's most controversial religious movements. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, founded by Joseph Smith in 1830, had faced persecution from the very beginning. Their unique beliefs, including the practice of polygamy and baptizing the dead, made them outcasts wherever they tried to settle. Smith and his followers were driven from New York to Ohio, then to Missouri, and finally to Illinois. At each location, suspicion and hostility followed them. Local authorities accused Smith of fraud, while ordinary citizens viewed Mormon practices with a mixture of fear and disgust. The situation reached a breaking point in 1844 when an angry mob stormed the jail in Carthage, Illinois, and murdered Joseph Smith while he awaited trial. Smith's death sent shockwaves through the Mormon community. His successor, Brigham Young, a man of fierce determination and unwavering conviction, made a fateful decision. He would lead his people beyond the reach of American law, to a promised land where they could practice their faith without interference. In 1846, thousands of Mormons began their epic journey westward, seeking refuge in the Utah Territory, then part of Mexico. By the time Young's followers reached the Salt Lake Valley, the land had become American territory following the Mexican-American War. What Young had hoped would be their sanctuary from federal authority was once again under United States jurisdiction. President James Buchanan appointed Young as territorial governor, but tensions quickly escalated when Young began implementing policies that directly contradicted federal law. Young declared martial law throughout the territory, forbidding entry without official permission and establishing his own legal system that recognized polygamy and rejected federal authority. When Congress refused to grant Utah statehood as the independent nation of Deseret, Young initiated the Mormon Reformation of 1856, a period of religious fervor that preached complete separation from non-Mormon society. During this Reformation, Young's rhetoric became increasingly militant. He reminded his followers of past persecutions, warned of impending dangers from outsiders, and emphasized that Mormons could only trust each other. Gentiles, as non-Mormons were called, were portrayed as enemies of God's chosen people. Young declared that his community was beyond federal law, answerable only to divine authority. The situation deteriorated further when news reached Utah of the murder of prominent Mormon leader Parley Pratt in Arkansas. Pratt had been killed by the husband of a woman he had taken as his 12th wife, but Mormons viewed his death as evidence of a broader conspiracy against their faith. Paranoia reached fever pitch when reports arrived that President Buchanan was sending federal troops to Utah to replace Young as governor. Young's response was swift and decisive. He declared that no one could enter Mormon territory without permission, and anyone attempting to do so would be treated as an enemy spy. The Utah War had begun, and into this powder keg of suspicion and religious hysteria came the Baker-Fancher wagon train. The wagon train, organized by Alexander Fancher and John Baker, consisted of approximately 137 men, women, and children from Arkansas. They had departed in April 1857, bound for California with their livestock, possessions, and dreams of a better life. The families included the Bakers, Fanchers, Millers, and Joneses, ordinary American pioneers seeking opportunity in the West. When the wagon train reached Salt Lake City in August 1857, they encountered immediate hostility. Mormon leaders, following Brigham Young's orders to stockpile supplies for the coming conflict with federal troops, refused to sell provisions to the travelers. The emigrants were told they were not welcome and were forced to continue south, following the old Spanish trail toward California. As the wagon train moved through Mormon settlements, rumors began to spread. Mormon leaders claimed the emigrants had insulted their faith, boasted of participating in the persecution of Mormons in Missouri and Illinois, and even bragged about possessing the gun that had killed Joseph Smith. There was no evidence to support these accusations, but in the charged atmosphere of 1857 Utah, truth mattered less than perception. The wagon train reached Mountain Meadows, a grassy valley that served as a traditional resting place for travelers, on September 4th. The meadows provided water and grazing for their animals, and the exhausted families set up camp, unaware that their presence had already been reported to Mormon militia leaders. Isaac Haight, a prominent Mormon leader and militia commander in Cedar City, viewed the wagon train as a threat that required immediate action. Along with William Dame and other local leaders, Haight began planning an attack. They sent a messenger to Brigham Young requesting guidance, but rather than wait for a response, they decided to proceed with their deadly plan. Haight summoned John Doyle Lee, an adopted son of Brigham Young and commander of the local militia, to Cedar City. According to Lee's later confession, Haight told him the emigrants were a dangerous group who had committed outrages against Mormon women and poisoned water sources, causing the death of cattle and making people sick. These accusations were complete fabrications, but Lee accepted them without question. The plan that emerged was as cunning as it was brutal. To avoid suspicion falling on the Mormon community, the attack would be disguised as an Indian raid. Mormon militiamen would paint their faces and dress as Paiute warriors, while actual Paiute allies would participate in exchange for promises of loot from the wagon train. On the morning of September 7, 1857, the disguised attackers struck without warning. The emigrants, caught completely off guard, quickly circled their wagons and began digging defensive positions. Despite the surprise attack, they fought back effectively, killing several attackers and wounding others. 7 emigrants died on the first day, with 16 more wounded, but the majority survived and prepared for a siege. For 5 agonizing days, the emigrants held their ground. They rationed their dwindling supplies of food and water while maintaining constant vigilance against their attackers. Children huddled with their mothers in the wagons while men took turns standing guard. The wounded suffered in the desert heat with minimal medical supplies, and hope began to fade as their ammunition ran low. As the siege continued, the Mormon leaders realized they faced a terrible dilemma. The emigrants had seen through the Indian disguise and could identify white men among their attackers. If any survived to tell their story, it would bring the full weight of federal justice down upon the Mormon community. There could be no witnesses left alive. On September 11th, John D. Lee approached the wagon train under a flag of truce. He told the desperate emigrants that he had negotiated with the Paiute warriors who had been attacking them. The Indians would allow safe passage if the emigrants surrendered their weapons and livestock as compensation for grievances. Lee presented himself as their savior, a fellow American who had risked his life to secure their freedom. The emigrants, faced with certain death if they remained in their defensive position, had no choice but to accept Lee's offer. They emerged from behind their wagons, laid down their weapons, and prepared to march to safety. Women gathered their children while men helped the wounded, believing their nightmare was finally over. Lee organized the emigrants into a column for the march to Cedar City. The wounded were placed in wagons at the front, followed by the women and children on foot, with the men bringing up the rear. Mormon militiamen, no longer disguised as Indians, walked alongside as supposed protectors. The procession moved slowly across the meadow, away from the defensive positions that had sheltered the emigrants for 5 terrible days. When the column had traveled about a mile from the wagons, Lee gave a prearranged signal. In an instant, the protectors became executioners. Each Mormon militiaman turned on the emigrant walking beside him, shooting or clubbing them to death. The carefully planned betrayal was executed with ruthless efficiency. The men died first, cut down before they could react to the treachery. Then the militiamen turned on the women and older children, using rifle butts, knives, and clubs to avoid wasting ammunition. Mothers died trying to shield their children while teenagers fled in terror across the meadow, only to be hunted down and killed. The massacre continued until the screaming stopped and silence returned to Mountain Meadows. When the killing was finished, approximately 120 men, women, and children lay dead. Only 17 children under the age of 7 were spared, deemed too young to serve as credible witnesses. These orphan children were distributed among Mormon families, though reports later suggested they were often treated poorly and forced to work as servants. The bodies of the victims were hastily buried in shallow graves scattered across the meadow. Their possessions, livestock, and wagons were divided among the perpetrators and sold to other Mormon settlers. The massacre site was cleaned of evidence, and the participants were sworn to absolute secrecy about what had transpired. Almost immediately, Mormon leaders began constructing an elaborate cover-up. They blamed the massacre entirely on Paiute Indians, claiming the emigrants had poisoned water sources and committed other outrages that provoked savage retaliation. This narrative was spread throughout the territory and reported to federal authorities as the official explanation for the tragedy. The cover-up required constant reinforcement and elaboration. Stories were invented about the emigrants' alleged crimes, including claims they had bragged about participating in the murder of Joseph Smith and had abused Mormon women during their journey through Utah. These fabrications were repeated so often that some Mormons came to believe them, while others remained silent out of fear or loyalty to their leaders. When federal investigators finally arrived at Mountain Meadows in 1859, they found evidence that contradicted the Indian raid narrative. Major James Henry Carleton, who led the investigation, discovered that the victims had been shot with firearms more advanced than those typically possessed by Native Americans. The positioning of bodies and the nature of wounds suggested a coordinated military-style execution rather than a chaotic battle. Carleton also interviewed Paiute leaders, who denied involvement in the massacre and claimed that any tribal members who participated had been hired as mercenaries by the Mormons. The investigators found items belonging to the emigrants in Mormon homes and observed the surviving children wearing their dead mother's jewelry and seeing their father's branded horses in Mormon stables. Despite overwhelming evidence of Mormon involvement, the investigation faced numerous obstacles. Key witnesses fled the territory, documents disappeared, and local officials provided no cooperation. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 diverted federal attention from Utah, allowing most of the perpetrators to escape justice indefinitely. Only John D. Lee was eventually brought to trial, nearly 20 years after the massacre. In 1877, he was convicted and executed by firing squad at Mountain Meadows, the site of his crimes. Lee maintained until his death that he had been made a scapegoat to protect higher-ranking church leaders, including Brigham Young himself. For 150 years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints maintained that the Mountain Meadows massacre was carried out by local leaders acting without authorization from church headquarters. They portrayed it as a tragic aberration, the result of wartime hysteria and poor judgment by men who had been driven to extremes by persecution and fear. This narrative began to crumble in the late 20th century as historians gained access to previously sealed church documents and conducted more thorough investigations. In 2007, on the 150th anniversary of the massacre, church leaders finally acknowledged that Mormons had been responsible for the killings and issued a formal apology to the descendants of the victims and to the Paiute people who had been falsely blamed. The Mountain Meadows massacre stands as one of the darkest chapters in American religious history, demonstrating how fear, fanaticism, and unchecked authority can transform ordinary people into killers. It reveals the dangerous potential of isolated communities that view themselves as persecuted minorities surrounded by enemies, and shows how religious rhetoric can be twisted to justify the most heinous acts. The victims of Mountain Meadows were not soldiers or criminals, but families seeking a better life in the American West. Their deaths serve as a reminder that the greatest threats to innocent people often come not from foreign enemies or savage outsiders, but from those who claim to act in the name of God while abandoning every principle of human decency. Today, Mountain Meadows is a National Historic Landmark, marked by monuments honoring both the victims who died there and the painful process of truth-telling that finally brought their story to light. The wagon train's ordeal at Mountain Meadows began on the morning of September 7, 1857, when the Baker Fancher party awoke to the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley. What they initially assumed might be distant hunting quickly revealed itself as something far more sinister. Rifle shots cracked through the early morning air, and within minutes, members of their party began falling to the ground, struck by bullets fired from concealed positions in the surrounding hills. The immigrants had no way of knowing that their attackers were primarily Mormon militiamen from the Iron County Brigade, disguised as Paiute Indians and accompanied by a handful of actual Paiute warriors who had been promised livestock and goods in exchange for their participation. The disguises were crude, but effective enough to maintain the deception from a distance. The Mormon attackers had darkened their skin with paint and mud, worn feathers and traditional Native American clothing, and adopted what they believed to be authentic war cries and battle tactics. John D. Lee, the Mormon militia leader who would later become the only person executed for the massacre, had spent the previous evening organizing the assault. According to his own confession given 20 years later, he had been told by his superior, Isaac Haight, that the Baker Fancher party posed a direct threat to Mormon survival in Utah. The immigrants were supposedly federal spies, Haight claimed, sent to gather intelligence before the arrival of Johnston's army. More inflammatory still were the accusations that members of the wagon train had boasted of participating in the murder of Joseph Smith and had threatened to return with federal troops to finish what they had started in Missouri and Illinois. None of these accusations were true, but in the climate of fear and paranoia that gripped Mormon settlements in 1857, they were accepted without question. The Baker Fancher party was composed of ordinary families seeking new opportunities in California, many of them farmers and tradesmen from Arkansas and Missouri who had pooled their resources for the dangerous journey west. They had no connection to federal authorities and no knowledge of the growing tensions between the Mormon leadership and the United States government. The initial attack caught the wagon train completely off guard. The immigrants had been camped in Mountain Meadows for several days, allowing their livestock to graze on the abundant grass while they rested and prepared for the difficult desert crossing that lay ahead. The meadow was a well-known stopping point for wagon trains, offering water, grass, and a relatively safe place to recover from the arduous journey across the mountains. When the shooting began, chaos erupted throughout the camp. Women screamed as they gathered their children and sought shelter behind wagons and supply crates. Men grabbed rifles and ammunition, trying to establish defensive positions while under fire from an enemy they could barely see. The Mormon attackers had positioned themselves strategically in the hills surrounding the meadow, using the terrain to their advantage while keeping their true identities concealed. Captain Alexander Fancher, one of the wagon train's leaders, quickly organized the defense. The immigrants corralled their wagons in a tight circle, a standard defensive formation known as forting up, that had been used by countless wagon trains when faced with hostile forces. They dug rifle pits beneath and between the wagons, creating protected firing positions from which they could return fire against their attackers. The siege that followed would last for 5 agonizing days. The Mormon militiamen, despite their numerical advantage and superior knowledge of the terrain, found themselves unable to overrun the wagon train's defenses. The immigrants, many of whom were experienced hunters and veterans of frontier conflicts, proved to be skilled marksmen who made every shot count. Their disciplined return fire prevented the attackers from advancing across the open ground of the meadow. During the first day of fighting, 7 members of the Baker Fancher party were killed and 16 others wounded. The casualties included men, women, and children, as the Mormon attackers made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Among the dead was a young woman who had been shot while trying to retrieve water from the nearby spring, and an elderly man who had been struck while attempting to tend to the livestock. As the siege continued, conditions within the wagon train's defensive perimeter deteriorated rapidly. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the trapped immigrants, and their water supplies began to run dangerously low. The attackers had deliberately positioned themselves to control access to the spring, making it nearly impossible for the defenders to replenish their water without exposing themselves to rifle fire. Food became another critical concern. While the wagon train carried substantial supplies for their journey to California, they had not prepared for an extended siege. With no way to hunt or forage, and their livestock either dead or scattered by the initial attack, the immigrants were forced to ration their remaining provisions carefully. The wounded presented perhaps the most heartbreaking challenge. With limited medical supplies and no trained physician among their number, the immigrants did their best to treat injuries that ranged from minor flesh wounds to life-threatening bullet wounds. Several of the wounded died during the siege, their bodies adding to the growing desperation within the wagon train's defensive circle. Meanwhile, the Mormon attackers faced their own set of problems. The prolonged siege had not been part of their original plan, which had called for a swift, decisive assault that would leave no survivors to tell the tale. The immigrants' stubborn resistance was forcing the militia to maintain their positions far longer than anticipated, increasing the risk that their true identities would be discovered. More troubling still was the growing involvement of actual Paiute warriors in the attack. While some Paiutes had agreed to participate in exchange for promised rewards, others were becoming suspicious of their Mormon allies' true motives. Chief Kanosh of the Pavant band, who maintained generally friendly relations with the Mormons, began asking uncomfortable questions about the siege and the unusual circumstances surrounding it. John D. Lee later testified that by the third day of the siege, several of the Mormon militiamen were having second thoughts about the attack. The sight of women and children trapped in the defensive circle, the cries of the wounded, and the increasingly desperate situation of the immigrants began to weigh heavily on some of the attackers' consciences. However, Isaac Haight and other militia leaders insisted that they had passed the point of no return. Too many people knew about the attack, and too many participants were involved for the massacre to be abandoned without consequences. The turning point came on September 10th, when a messenger arrived from Cedar City with disturbing news. Brigham Young's response to the request for guidance had finally arrived, but it was not the authorization the militia leaders had expected. According to later accounts, Young's message instructed the Cedar City Mormons to allow the wagon train to pass through unmolested and to treat the immigrants with kindness. The message had arrived too late. The siege was already in its fourth day, and the militia leaders knew that simply allowing the Baker-Fancher party to continue their journey was no longer an option. The immigrants had undoubtedly seen through the disguises of at least some of their attackers, and their testimony about the siege would inevitably reach federal authorities in California. The potential consequences for the Mormon community in southern Utah were too severe to contemplate. It was at this point that the militia leaders made the decision that would transform an already tragic situation into one of the most notorious massacres in American history. Rather than abandoning the attack or attempting to negotiate a peaceful resolution, they chose to escalate their assault with the explicit goal of ensuring that no adult members of the wagon train survived to tell their story. The plan they devised was as cynical as it was brutal. John D. Lee would approach the wagon train under a flag of truce, presenting himself as a local Mormon leader who had learned of the Paiute attack and come to offer assistance. He would tell the immigrants that he had negotiated with the Paiute warriors for their safe passage, but that the terms required the wagon train to surrender their weapons and allow themselves to be escorted out of the valley under Mormon protection. On the morning of September 11th, 1857, Lee rode into the meadow carrying a white flag and wearing his best civilian clothes to present himself as a respectable Mormon citizen rather than a military commander. The immigrants, desperate after 5 days of siege and running critically low on water and ammunition, received him with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Lee's performance was masterful in its deception. He expressed shock and sympathy at the immigrants' plight, claiming that he had only recently learned of the Paiute attack from travelers passing through Cedar City. He explained that the Paiute warriors were angry about alleged mistreatment by previous wagon trains and were demanding satisfaction before they would allow the Baker-Fancher party to continue their journey. The terms Lee presented seemed reasonable under the circumstances. The Paiutes would be satisfied with the wagon train's weapons and some of their livestock as compensation for past grievances. In exchange, the Mormon militia would escort the immigrants safely out of Paiute territory and provide them with enough supplies to reach California. The wounded would be transported in wagons, while the able-bodied adults would walk under armed guard to prevent any misunderstandings with the Paiute warriors. After brief deliberation among the wagon train's leaders, the offer was accepted. The immigrants had little choice. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, their water was gone, and several more of their number had died during the night. The prospect of safe passage, even under the humiliating terms Lee had presented, seemed preferable to certain death from thirst and continued siege. What followed was a carefully orchestrated betrayal that demonstrated both the premeditation and the cold-blooded nature of the massacre. As the immigrants emerged from their defensive positions and began to surrender their weapons, they were organized into a column according to Lee's specific instructions. The wounded and small children were loaded into wagons at the front of the procession. The women and older children were formed into a group that would walk in the middle of the column. The adult men were placed at the rear, each one assigned a Mormon militiaman as an escort. The column began its march out of Mountain Meadows with Lee riding at the front, maintaining his role as the immigrants' protector and guide. The Mormon militiamen, still partially disguised and claiming to be volunteers from Cedar City, walked alongside their assigned charges while maintaining casual conversation designed to put the immigrants at ease. For nearly a mile, the procession continued without incident. The immigrants, despite their exhaustion and traumatic ordeal, began to show signs of relief as they put distance between themselves and the site of the siege. Some of the women were heard to express gratitude to their Mormon escorts, while several of the men discussed their plans for resuming their journey to California once they had recovered from their ordeal. The massacre began with a prearranged signal. According to John D. Lee's later confession, the signal was a specific phrase, "Halt." At this command, each Mormon militiaman was to immediately kill the immigrant assigned to his care, while other hidden attackers would emerge from concealment to eliminate any survivors. The adult men at the rear of the column were the first to die. Most were shot at point-blank range by their supposed protectors before they had time to understand what was happening. Those who managed to avoid the initial volley were quickly overwhelmed by additional attackers who emerged from the brush along the trail. The women and older children, walking in the middle section of the column, initially thought the gunfire behind them was another Paiute attack. Their confusion turned to horror as Mormon militiamen began shooting and clubbing them to death. Unlike the men, who were killed primarily with firearms, many of the women and children were murdered with knives, hatchets, and rifle butts in an apparent attempt to conserve ammunition. The slaughter was neither quick nor clean. Many of the victims, particularly the women and children, fought desperately for their lives, trying to flee across the open ground or pleading with their attackers for mercy. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of unimaginable brutality, with some victims being struck repeatedly before finally succumbing to their wounds. Rebecca Dunlap, a young woman traveling with her husband and infant child, was reportedly among the last to die. Witnesses later testified that she ran nearly a quarter-mile across the desert while carrying her baby, pursued by mounted militiamen who treated her flight as sport before finally running her down and killing both mother and child. The massacre lasted less than an hour from beginning to end. When the killing finally stopped, approximately 120 men, women, and children lay dead along the trail leading out of Mountain Meadows. Only 17 children, all under the age of 8, had been spared, deemed too young to serve as credible witnesses to the atrocity they had witnessed. The aftermath of the massacre revealed the extent of the Mormon militia's premeditation and organization. The bodies of the victims were hastily stripped of valuables and buried in shallow graves, barely covered with rocks and brush. The wagon train's livestock, supplies, and personal belongings were gathered and distributed among the Mormon participants, with the most valuable items being reserved for the militia leaders. The surviving children were divided among Mormon families in the Cedar City area, with John D. Lee himself taking custody of several of them. While some of these families may have genuinely intended to care for the orphaned children, others appeared to view them primarily as additional labor for their households. When federal investigators later recovered the children, many were found to be malnourished, poorly clothed, and showing signs of physical abuse. The cover-up began immediately after the massacre. The Mormon participants were sworn to secrecy and instructed to maintain the fiction that Paiute warriors had been responsible for the attack. Local church leaders prepared elaborate explanations for the presence of the wagon train's goods in Mormon households, claiming they had purchased the items from Paiute traders who had presumably looted them from the massacre site. Brigham Young's response to news of the massacre revealed the extent to which Mormon leadership was willing to go to protect their community from federal retaliation. Rather than conducting a genuine investigation or punishing those responsible, Young endorsed the cover-up and helped refine the official story that would be maintained for decades to come. The Mountain Meadows Massacre stands as one of the most shocking betrayals of trust in American history, a calculated act of mass murder disguised as an act of mercy. The immigrants who died in that desert valley had placed their faith in their supposed rescuers, only to discover too late that they had surrendered themselves to their executioners. The year 1857 would prove to be a turning point that transformed isolated incidents of fanaticism into something far more sinister and systematic. As federal troops marched toward Utah Territory under President James Buchanan's orders, the atmosphere within Mormon settlements shifted from defensive preparation to outright paranoia. Brigham Young's declaration of martial law had effectively isolated his followers from the outside world, creating a pressure cooker environment where suspicion and fear would soon boil over into unthinkable violence. The Baker-Fancher wagon train represented everything the Mormon leadership had come to fear about outsiders. Here was a group of well-armed, well-supplied immigrants from Arkansas, traveling through Utah without explicit permission during a time when Young had forbidden such passage. To the increasingly isolated Mormon communities, these travelers weren't just inconvenient visitors. They were potential spies, federal agents, or at minimum, hostile Gentiles who posed an existential threat to their way of life. What made the situation particularly volatile was the systematic way Mormon leaders had conditioned their followers to view conflict in apocalyptic terms. The Mormon Reformation of 1856 had deliberately heightened religious fervor while simultaneously demonizing outsiders. Young's fiery sermons about blood atonement, the necessity of protecting Zion, and the righteousness of violence in defense of the faith had created a theological framework that could justify almost any action against perceived enemies. The decision to attack the Baker-Fancher party wasn't made by a single individual acting in passion or desperation. Instead, it emerged from a calculated assessment by multiple Mormon leaders who concluded that these immigrants posed an unacceptable risk to their community's security. Isaac Haight, the stake president in Cedar City, and William Dame, the local militia commander, didn't act on impulse when they began planning the assault. They deliberated, consulted with subordinates, and developed a strategy designed to eliminate what they saw as a threat while maintaining plausible deniability. The sophistication of their planning reveals just how far the Mormon leadership had moved from their original religious principles. The decision to disguise themselves as Paiute Indians wasn't simply about avoiding immediate detection. It was part of a comprehensive cover-up strategy that would allow them to blame Native Americans for what they knew would be seen as an atrocity by the outside world. This level of premeditation distinguishes the Mountain Meadows Massacre from spontaneous acts of frontier violence. John D. Lee's role in the massacre demonstrates how religious authority could be weaponized to overcome individual moral resistance. When Lee later confessed to his participation, he described feeling compelled to follow orders from his religious superiors, even when those orders violated his personal conscience. The Mormon concept of unquestioning obedience to priesthood authority had created a system where ordinary men could be convinced to participate in mass murder simply because their leaders presented it as God's will. The 5-day siege that preceded the final massacre reveals the calculated nature of the Mormon attack. This wasn't a brief moment of violence that spiraled out of control, but a sustained military operation that required coordination, supply lines, and strategic planning. The Mormon militia maintained their assault for nearly a week, during which time they had multiple opportunities to reconsider their actions or seek alternative solutions. Instead, they doubled down on their commitment to eliminate the entire wagon train. The decision to spare only children under the age of 7 wasn't an act of mercy, but a coldly pragmatic calculation about which witnesses could be safely allowed to survive. Mormon leaders understood that very young children would be unlikely to provide credible testimony about the identities of their attackers, while older children and adults posed an unacceptable risk of exposure. This age-based selection process reveals the methodical thinking that characterized every aspect of the massacre. The final betrayal, when Lee approached the wagon train under a flag of truce, represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the entire event. After days of siege, the emigrants were desperate for any hope of survival. When a seemingly sympathetic figure offered them safe passage in exchange for their weapons, they had little choice but to trust him. The systematic way the Mormons then separated men, women, and children before executing them shows a level of organization that contradicts any narrative of spontaneous violence. The aftermath of the massacre demonstrates how religious communities can rationalize and cover up even the most heinous crimes when they believe their survival depends on it. The immediate response wasn't guilt or horror at what had been done, but a coordinated effort to construct a believable, alternative narrative. The story about poisoned water sources that killed Paiute Indians, who then sought revenge against the wagon train, was fabricated with the same attention to detail that had characterized the massacre itself. What makes the cover-up particularly chilling is how quickly the Mormon community mobilized to support it. Participants were sworn to secrecy, evidence was destroyed or hidden, and an entire community agreed to maintain a false narrative for decades. This wasn't simply a matter of protecting a few guilty individuals, but preserving what they saw as the integrity of their entire religious movement. The willingness of so many people to participate in this deception reveals how completely they had internalized the belief that their actions were justified by their religious mission. The distribution of the victims' property among Mormon families shows how the massacre had become not just an act of violence, but an economic opportunity. Livestock, wagons, and personal possessions were sold or distributed as if they were legitimate spoils of war rather than the belongings of murdered innocents. This commercialization of the crime reveals how thoroughly the perpetrators had dehumanized their victims. The treatment of the surviving children provides another window into the moral universe the Mormon perpetrators had created for themselves. Rather than viewing these orphans as victims deserving compassion, many in the community saw them as burdens or potential threats. Reports of neglect and abuse suggest that even the act of sparing these children hadn't been motivated by genuine mercy, but by cold calculation about minimizing risk. The federal investigation that eventually followed revealed the sophisticated nature of the cover-up, but also highlighted how difficult it could be to penetrate a closed religious community determined to protect its secrets. Major James Henry Carleton's investigation uncovered compelling evidence of Mormon involvement, but the community's unified silence and the destruction of physical evidence made it nearly impossible to build cases against most of the perpetrators. The fact that only John D. Lee was ultimately executed for the massacre speaks to both the effectiveness of the cover-up and the challenges facing federal authorities in prosecuting crimes committed by religious communities. Lee's execution in 1877, 20 years after the massacre, provided a form of symbolic justice, but it also allowed the broader Mormon community to treat him as a scapegoat rather than confronting the systemic factors that had made the massacre possible. The Mountain Meadows massacre represents more than just a historical atrocity. It serves as a case study in how religious extremism can transform ordinary people into killers. The Mormon perpetrators weren't inherently evil individuals. but rather believers who had been systematically conditioned to view violence against outsiders as not only acceptable, but religiously mandated. Their crime emerged from a toxic combination of isolation, paranoia, unquestioning obedience to authority, and a theological framework that dehumanized those outside their faith community. The long delay in the Mormon Church's acknowledgement of responsibility for the massacre demonstrates how institutions can perpetuate historical lies when the truth threatens their legitimacy. For 150 years, the Church maintained narratives that shifted blame to others, protected the reputations of leaders, and minimized their followers' culpability. Only in 2007, when maintaining these false narratives had become more damaging than admitting the truth, did the Church finally take responsibility for what had been done in its name. Today, the Mountain Meadows Massacre stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when religious fervor overrides basic human decency. The monument that now marks the site serves not just as a memorial to those who died, but as a warning about the dangers of religious extremism, authoritarian leadership, and the willingness of communities to commit atrocities in defense of their beliefs. So as the smoke cleared from the Valley of Despair and the bodies of the Baker-Fancher party lay scattered across Mountain Meadows, the real horror was just beginning. Because what happened next would prove that the massacre itself was only the first act in a much darker play. The Mormon militia hadn't just committed mass murder. They had crossed a line that would transform them from religious zealots into something far more sinister. Cold-blooded conspirators willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to protect their terrible secret. The aftermath of September 11, 1857 revealed the true nature of those who had orchestrated this atrocity. These weren't men driven by religious passion in a moment of heated conflict. They were calculating predators who methodically eliminated witnesses, fabricated evidence, and manipulated an entire community to cover their tracks. What unfolded in the days and weeks following the massacre would demonstrate a level of organizational evil that rivals anything in American criminal history. The 17 children who survived, all under the age of 8, became unwitting witnesses to the conspiracy that followed. Taken into Mormon homes supposedly out of mercy, these orphans were actually human insurance policies, living proof that the attackers had shown restraint and compassion. But the reality of their treatment tells a different story entirely. These children, traumatized beyond comprehension by watching their parents and siblings butchered before their eyes, were subjected to systematic psychological abuse designed to erase their memories and reshape their understanding of what had happened. Sarah Frances Baker, just 4 years old when she watched her mother beaten to death with rifle stocks, would later testify about the constant terror she experienced in her Mormon foster home. She was forbidden from speaking her family's name, told repeatedly that her parents had been evil people who deserved to die, and punished severely whenever she showed signs of remembering the truth. The other children faced similar treatment. Psychological warfare waged against innocent minds too young to understand why the adults around them were trying to steal their very identities. But the children weren't the only witnesses who needed to be managed. Several Paiute Indians who had been coerced into participating in the early stages of the attack possessed dangerous knowledge about Mormon involvement. Rather than simply relying on their silence, Mormon leaders took a more direct approach. Within 6 months of the massacre, at least 3 Paiute men who had been present during the attack were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Local Mormon authorities attributed these deaths to tribal conflicts, but federal investigators would later determine that each had been deliberately killed to prevent them from contradicting the official story. The systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses extended beyond the Paiute community. Thomas Willis, a Mormon militiaman who had expressed private doubts about the massacre to his wife, disappeared while traveling to Salt Lake City in November 1857. James McGuffey, another militiaman who had begun drinking heavily and making cryptic references to terrible deeds that haunt my dreams, was discovered dead in his home in February 1858. The official cause of death was listed as accidental poisoning, but neighbors reported that McGuffey had been visited by John D. Lee the night before his death. When federal investigators later examined McGuffey's body, they found evidence consistent with strychnine poisoning, a substance readily available to Lee through his connections with local traders. The conspiracy to conceal the truth about Mountain Meadows involved virtually every level of Mormon leadership in southern Utah. Stake President William Dame, who had given the initial authorization for the attack, orchestrated an elaborate campaign of disinformation that would make modern propaganda specialists envious. Dame understood that simply denying Mormon involvement wouldn't be sufficient. The massacre was too large, too brutal, and had left too much evidence to be dismissed as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Instead, Dame crafted a multi-layered narrative designed to redirect blame while positioning the Mormon community as secondary victims of Indian savagery. The story began with the fabrication of provocations. According to Dame's version, the Baker-Fancher party had committed a series of escalating outrages during their journey through Utah. They had allegedly poisoned water sources, killing Paiute livestock and children. They had supposedly bragged about participating in the persecution of Mormons in Missouri and Illinois. Most inflammatory of all, they had reportedly claimed to possess the very gun that had killed the prophet Joseph Smith. None of these allegations were true, but Dame understood that the more outrageous the claims, the more likely they were to be believed by people already predisposed to see outsiders as enemies. He dispatched trusted associates throughout the territory to spread these stories, ensuring that by the time federal investigators arrived, they would encounter a unified community convinced that the Baker-Fancher party had deserved their fate. But Dame's propaganda campaign was only the beginning. He also orchestrated the physical destruction of evidence with the thoroughness of a professional criminal organization. The hastily dug graves at Mountain Meadows were excavated under cover of darkness, and the bodies were relocated to more remote locations throughout the region. Personal belongings that could identify the victims were systematically destroyed, with one notable exception. Items of particular value, jewelry, weapons, and livestock were distributed among the Mormon community as rewards for silence. This distribution of stolen goods served multiple purposes. It ensured that virtually every Mormon family in the region became complicit in the cover-up, making them less likely to cooperate with outside investigators. It also created a network of material evidence that would be difficult for authorities to trace back to the original crime. When federal agents eventually began their investigation, they found Baker-Fancher property scattered across dozens of Mormon homes, each family claiming to have acquired their items through legitimate trade or purchase. Perhaps most cunningly, Dame arranged for the creation of fake documentation to support his fabricated timeline. Mormon record keepers, who had previously maintained meticulous accounts of community activities, suddenly developed selective amnesia about events surrounding September 11, 1857. Church records from that period show suspicious gaps and obvious alterations. Meeting minutes that would have documented the planning of the massacre were either destroyed or modified to remove incriminating references. Dame even commissioned the creation of entirely fraudulent documents designed to implicate the Paiute Indians. Letters supposedly written by Indian leaders were fabricated and backdated to create the impression of growing Native American hostility toward immigrants. These forgeries were then discovered by Mormon authorities and presented to federal investigators as evidence of Paiute guilt. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond southern Utah. Brigham Young, despite his later claims of ignorance, was almost certainly aware of the massacre within days of its occurrence. Evidence suggests that Young not only knew about the atrocity, but actively participated in the cover-up. When the messenger sent to seek Young's guidance about the Baker-Fancher party returned to Cedar City, he carried more than just Young's supposed instructions to let the emigrants pass safely. He also brought detailed guidance on how to manage the aftermath of what Young apparently already knew had become a massacre. Young's instructions, according to testimony later provided by the messenger himself, included specific directions about disposing of evidence, managing witnesses, and coordinating the story that would be presented to federal authorities. Young reportedly emphasized that the survival of the entire Mormon community in Utah depended on ensuring that no connection between the church leadership and the massacre could ever be proven. Under Young's direction, The Mormon community implemented what federal investigators would later describe as the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy in 19th century America. Church leaders established secure communication networks that allowed them to coordinate their stories across hundreds of miles. They created safe houses where participants in the massacre could hide when federal agents came looking for them. They even established an early warning system that gave conspirators advance notice when investigators were approaching their communities. The psychological manipulation of the Mormon community itself was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the conspiracy. Young and his subordinates understood that maintaining the cover-up would require the active cooperation of thousands of people, most of whom had not directly participated in the massacre. They achieved this cooperation through a combination of religious indoctrination, social pressure, and carefully managed fear. Sermons delivered throughout Mormon communities in the months following the massacre emphasized themes of loyalty, persecution, and the dangers posed by outside interference. Members were repeatedly told that federal investigators were not seeking justice, but rather looking for excuses to destroy the Mormon community entirely. They were warned that any Mormon who cooperated with federal authorities would be betraying not just their neighbors, but God Himself. This religious manipulation was reinforced by more earthly concerns. Mormon communities in Utah were largely self-sufficient, but they still depended on the church hierarchy for access to land, water rights, and trading opportunities. Young made it clear that any Mormon who failed to support the official story about Mountain Meadows would find themselves cut off from these essential resources. In a territory where the church controlled virtually every aspect of economic life, this threat was effectively a death sentence. The conspiracy also included elements of witness intimidation that went far beyond economic pressure. Mormon leaders established what they called councils of safety in communities throughout the territory. These councils, supposedly created to protect Mormon settlements from Indian attacks, actually functioned as enforcement arms of the cover-up. Council members were tasked with monitoring their neighbors for signs of disloyalty and reporting any suspicious conversations to church authorities. Several Mormons who expressed private doubts about the official story of Mountain Meadows found themselves subjected to escalating harassment. Their property was vandalized, their livestock mysteriously sickened, and their children were shunned at school. In extreme cases, dissenting Mormons were subjected to what church leaders called discipline, a euphemism for physical violence designed to ensure silence. The effectiveness of this comprehensive conspiracy became apparent when federal investigators finally arrived in Utah in 1859. Major James Henry Carleton, despite his military training and investigative experience, found himself confronting a wall of coordinated deception, unlike anything he had previously encountered. Witnesses provided identical testimonies that had obviously been rehearsed. Physical evidence had been systematically destroyed or contaminated. Even children who had survived the massacre had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that their accounts supported the fabricated story of Paiute responsibility. He noted that the level of coordination required to maintain such an elaborate deception suggested planning and organization that went far beyond the capabilities of local Mormon leaders acting independently. Despite these obstacles, Carleton's investigation gradually uncovered evidence of Mormon involvement. The turning point came when several Paiute leaders, frustrated by continued accusations against their people, agreed to provide testimony about what had really happened. Chief Kanosh of the Pavant band told Carleton that while some Paiute warriors had initially participated in the attack, they had been recruited and directed by Mormon leaders who promised them livestock and other rewards. More damaging still was the testimony of a Paiute warrior named Nephi Johnson, who had been present during the planning meetings that preceded the massacre. Johnson provided detailed accounts of conversations between John D. Lee, Isaac Haight, and other Mormon leaders in which they discussed the necessity of killing all the emigrants to prevent them from reporting Mormon involvement in the initial attack. As evidence of Mormon guilt accumulated, the conspiracy began to show signs of strain. Some participants, burdened by guilt and fear of divine judgment, began to crack under the pressure of maintaining their lies. Philip Klingensmith, who had served as a bishop in the Mormon Church at the time of the massacre, eventually fled Utah and provided federal authorities with a detailed confession of Mormon involvement. Klingensmith's testimony revealed the cynical calculations that had motivated the massacre. According to his account, Mormon leaders had initially hoped to use Paiute Indians to drive the Baker-Fancher party away from Utah without direct Mormon involvement. When this plan failed and the emigrants fought back effectively, the Mormons faced a dilemma. They could allow the emigrants to continue their journey, knowing that they would likely report the attack to federal authorities, or they could escalate the conflict to ensure that no witnesses survived to tell the tale. The decision to commit mass murder, according to Klingensmith, was made not in the heat of religious passion but during a cold-blooded council meeting where Mormon leaders weighed their options like businessmen calculating profit and loss. The lives of 120 innocent people were reduced to a simple equation. Their deaths were necessary to protect the larger interests of the Mormon community in Utah. This revelation struck at the heart of the conspiracy's carefully constructed narrative. For years, Mormon leaders had portrayed the massacre as a tragic misunderstanding, an unfortunate result of heightened tensions and Indian savagery. Klingensmith's testimony revealed it as something far more sinister, a calculated act of mass murder carried out by men who claimed to represent God's will on earth. The psychological impact of this revelation extended far beyond the Mormon community. Americans throughout the nation were forced to confront the disturbing reality that their fellow citizens were capable of organized atrocity on a scale that rivaled anything committed by foreign enemies. The Mountain Meadows Massacre challenged fundamental assumptions about American civilization and the moral authority of religious institutions. As the full scope of the conspiracy became apparent, federal authorities faced a dilemma of their own. Prosecuting everyone involved in the massacre and its cover-up would require arresting hundreds of Mormons, potentially destabilizing the entire Utah territory. The ongoing civil war made such a massive enforcement action impractical, as federal resources were desperately needed elsewhere. The solution was a compromise that satisfied no one but served the immediate needs of political expediency. John D. Lee, who had served as the primary executioner during the massacre, was selected as the primary scapegoat. His trial and execution would provide symbolic justice while allowing the broader conspiracy to remain largely unpunished. This decision outraged Lee, who correctly pointed out that he had been following orders from his superiors and that dozens of other men had participated in the killings. His words carried the ring of truth, but by then the political machinery of justice had already determined his fate. The execution of John D. Lee in 1877 marked the official end of the Mountain Meadows Massacre investigation, but it solved none of the fundamental questions raised by the atrocity. The conspiracy that had enabled the massacre remained largely intact, its participants protected by a combination of political calculation and public exhaustion with the case. In the decades that followed, the Mormon Church would gradually acknowledge greater responsibility for the massacre. But this process of confession and reconciliation took more than 150 years to complete. The conspiracy of silence that began in September 1857 proved more durable than the lives it was designed to protect. Today, the Mountain Meadows Massacre serves as a stark reminder of how quickly civilized communities can descend into barbarism when fear, prejudice, and unchecked authority combine. The conspiracy that followed the massacre demonstrates how institutions designed to provide moral guidance can become engines of evil when their leaders prioritize self-preservation over truth and justice. The story of Mountain Meadows is not just about religious extremism or frontier violence. It is about the capacity for ordinary people to become complicit in extraordinary evil when they are convinced that their survival depends on maintaining a lie. It is about the danger of communities that value loyalty over truth and institutions that place their own interests above the lives of innocent people. Most disturbingly, it is about how easily the mechanisms of civilization can be turned to the service of atrocity when those in authority are willing to exploit the trust and faith of their followers. The Mormon leaders who orchestrated the Mountain Meadows Massacre and its cover-up understood that their greatest weapon was not violence, but the willingness of their community to believe that their actions served a higher purpose. This willingness to accept authority without question, to trust leaders without verification, and to maintain silence in the face of obvious evil represents a vulnerability that exists within every human community. The conspiracy of Mountain Meadows succeeded not because it was particularly sophisticated, but because it exploited fundamental human weaknesses that remain as relevant today as they were in 1857. The federal investigation that unfolded through 1851 and 1852 revealed the Mountain Meadows Massacre to be far more than a spontaneous act of religious extremism. Like the methodical horrors uncovered beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit, this atrocity emerged from years of systematic indoctrination, paranoia, and the dangerous fusion of religious authority with militant action. What investigators discovered was a community that had been psychologically prepared for violence through months of inflammatory rhetoric from Mormon leadership. Brigham Young's Mormon Reformation of 1856 to 1857 had created an atmosphere of siege mentality, where outsiders were automatically viewed as enemies and violence was justified as divine protection. The Fancher-Baker wagon train had walked unknowingly into this powder keg of religious fanaticism and territorial paranoia. The massacre itself demonstrated the same calculated deception seen in other historical atrocities. The Mormon militia's decision to disguise themselves as Paiute Indians revealed their awareness that their actions were criminal, requiring elaborate cover-ups from the very beginning. This wasn't the heat-of-the-moment violence of a mob, but the methodical execution of a plan designed to eliminate witnesses while maintaining plausible deniability. Most chilling was the final act of betrayal on September 11, 1857. John D. Lee's approach under a flag of truce, offering safe passage to the desperate emigrants, represented a calculated exploitation of their trust. The systematic separation of men, women, and children before the coordinated killing revealed military-style planning that contradicted any claims of spontaneous Indian violence. The decision to spare only children under 6 years old demonstrated the cold pragmatism behind the massacre. These weren't acts of religious passion, but calculated decisions based on the perpetrator's assessment of which witnesses could later identify them. The fact that these surviving children were found wearing their murdered mother's jewelry and that their father's branded horses were discovered in Mormon stables provided damning evidence of the true perpetrators. Federal investigators, led by Major James Henry Carleton, methodically dismantled the Mormon leadership's fabricated narrative about poisoned springs and Indian revenge. The story had been constructed backwards, starting with the desired conclusion that Paiutes were responsible, then inventing justifications for why such an attack might have occurred. When actual Paiute leaders categorically denied involvement and pointed to Mormon orchestration, the cover-up began to collapse. The broader context of the Utah War cannot be ignored in understanding how this massacre occurred. Brigham Young's declaration of martial law and his rhetoric about Mormon independence from federal authority had created a quasi-sovereign state where normal legal and moral constraints were suspended. His followers had been conditioned to see themselves as a chosen people surrounded by enemies, making extreme measures seem not only justified but necessary for survival. The investigation revealed how religious communities can become isolated echo chambers where extreme ideologies flourish unchecked. The Mormon settlers in Utah had been systematically cut off from outside perspectives, fed a steady diet of persecution narratives, and taught to view any questioning of leadership as apostasy. This created the perfect conditions for atrocity, where normal moral inhibitions were overridden by group loyalty and religious fervor. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic nature of the cover-up that followed. The immediate burial of evidence, the coordination of false testimonies, and the elaborate mythology created to blame the Paiutes demonstrated that the Mormon leadership understood the criminal nature of their actions. They weren't delusional fanatics who believed they were doing God's work, but calculating individuals who knew they had committed mass murder and needed to avoid consequences. The treatment of the surviving children provides another window into the perpetrator's mindset. Reports varied about their condition, but the consistent theme was that they were kept as trophies of sorts, physical reminders of the massacre that some Mormon families seemed to take pride in possessing. The children's ability to identify their family's belongings in Mormon homes revealed not just evidence of the crime, but a callous disregard for the trauma these young survivors had endured. The federal investigation also exposed the complicity of Mormon leadership beyond the immediate participants. George A. Smith's instructions not to trade with the Fancher Party, Brigham Young's inflammatory rhetoric about outsiders, and the broader institutional support for militant resistance to federal authority all contributed to creating the conditions where such an atrocity became possible. What emerged from testimonies and recovered documents was a picture of systematic radicalization, where ordinary people were gradually conditioned to accept and participate in extreme violence. The process wasn't unlike what investigators had found in other cases of institutional evil, where authority figures slowly normalized increasingly extreme behaviors until mass murder seemed not only acceptable, but necessary. The long delay in bringing anyone to justice revealed another troubling aspect of the case. The outbreak of the Civil War, the remote location of Utah Territory, and the Mormon community's continued protection of the perpetrators allowed most of those responsible to escape consequences entirely. Only John D. Lee was ultimately executed, and even then, only after years of hiding and changing political circumstances that made a scapegoat necessary. The Mountain Meadows Massacre stands as a stark reminder of how quickly civilized communities can descend into barbarism when the right conditions align. Religious extremism, authoritarian leadership, isolation from outside perspectives, and a siege mentality combined to create an environment where mass murder could be planned, executed, and covered up by people who considered themselves faithful Christians. The legacy of Mountain Meadows extends far beyond the immediate tragedy. It demonstrates how institutions can systematically corrupt individuals, how authority figures can manipulate religious devotion to justify atrocity, and how communities can maintain elaborate deceptions for generations when confronting the truth would threaten their fundamental identity. Most sobering is the recognition that the conditions that enabled Mountain Meadows, paranoia about outsiders, unquestioning loyalty to charismatic leaders, and the belief that one's group is specially chosen and therefore above normal moral constraints, continue to exist in various forms today. The investigation into the Mountain Meadows Massacre was hampered from the very beginning by a systematic campaign of deception and obstruction that would make uncovering the truth nearly impossible for decades. The Mormon leadership, understanding the devastating implications of what had truly occurred, implemented a coordinated strategy of misdirection that went far beyond simple denial. Within hours of the massacre's completion, Isaac Haight and William Dame initiated what can only be described as an organized conspiracy. The surviving children, those 17 souls deemed too young to bear witness, were quickly dispersed among Mormon families throughout the territory. But this wasn't an act of mercy. These placements were carefully orchestrated to ensure the children would be isolated from each other and from any outside contact that might help them piece together their fragmented memories. The physical evidence required immediate attention. The hastily dug graves were inadequate for concealing the magnitude of the crime. Work parties were organized under the cover of darkness to relocate bodies, scatter remains, and eliminate any traces that might contradict the fabricated narrative they were constructing. Personal belongings from the wagon train, including jewelry, clothing, and branded livestock, were distributed throughout the Mormon community with strict instructions about their origins. Perhaps most insidiously, the perpetrators began the process of psychological manipulation that would sustain their deception for generations. Every participant in the massacre was required to take a blood oath of silence, swearing before God and their fellow Mormons that they would never reveal the truth of what had transpired. This wasn't merely a request for discretion, but a sacred covenant that carried the implicit threat of divine retribution for any who might break their silence. The fabrication of the Poison Springs story represents one of the most calculated pieces of propaganda in American frontier history. The narrative was meticulously crafted to serve multiple purposes. It provided a plausible motive for Paiute aggression while simultaneously portraying the emigrants as hostile and dangerous individuals who had brought their fate upon themselves. The story suggested that the deaths of Paiute Indians from poisoned water had triggered a justified act of revenge, transforming mass murder into understandable retaliation. But the poisoned springs narrative required constant reinforcement and elaboration. Mormon leaders dispatched trusted emissaries throughout the territory to spread consistent versions of the story. These weren't casual conversations, but coordinated information campaigns designed to establish an unshakable consensus about what had supposedly occurred. Church sermons reinforced the narrative, with Brigham Young himself lending credibility to the deception through carefully worded statements that never explicitly endorsed the story, but never contradicted it either. The treatment of the Paiute people reveals the depths of Mormon callousness in the aftermath of the massacre. Having used some Paiutes as willing participants and others as unwitting accomplices, the Mormon leadership now systematically scapegoated the entire tribe. They spread stories of Paiute savagery and unpredictability, painting them as natural suspects for such an atrocity. When Paiute leaders like Chief Kanosh attempted to distance themselves from the massacre and provide truthful accounts, their voices were deliberately suppressed and discredited. The Mormon community's collective participation in this deception extended far beyond the immediate perpetrators. Families who had received property from the wagon train were instructed to claim they had acquired these items through legitimate trade. Women wearing jewelry torn from the corpses of murdered immigrants were coached on believable stories about their origins. Children were taught modified versions of events that would allow them to participate in the community's shared fiction without technically lying about what they had personally witnessed. When federal investigators finally arrived, they encountered a wall of coordinated resistance that had been 2 years in the making. Every potential witness had been thoroughly prepared. Every piece of evidence had been carefully managed or eliminated. The investigators found themselves dealing not with a crime scene but with a community-wide performance designed to frustrate any attempt at uncovering the truth. The sophistication of this cover-up operation reveals planning and coordination that extended to the highest levels of Mormon leadership. The consistency of stories across hundreds of participants, the systematic elimination of physical evidence, and the successful suppression of contradictory accounts could not have been achieved without central direction and ongoing management. This was not the panicked aftermath of an impulsive crime, but the calculated implementation of a comprehensive strategy to avoid accountability. The psychological impact of maintaining this deception created its own form of ongoing trauma within the Mormon community. Participants in the massacre lived with the constant stress of maintaining their false narratives while dealing with the guilt and horror of what they had actually done. Families were divided by secrets that could never be spoken. Children grew up in households where certain topics were absolutely forbidden, creating an atmosphere of perpetual tension and unspoken dread. The cover-up also required the ongoing suppression of the surviving children's memories and testimonies. As these children grew older and began to recover more complete recollections of the massacre, Mormon families who had taken them in faced increasingly difficult challenges in maintaining the official narrative. Some children were relocated multiple times to prevent them from forming attachments that might encourage them to speak freely about their experiences. The economic aspects of the cover-up were equally systematic. The livestock and goods stolen from the wagon train represented substantial wealth that had been distributed throughout the Mormon community. Creating legitimate explanations for the sudden appearance of this property required careful coordination and the creation of false documentation. Bills of sale were backdated, trade agreements were fabricated, and entire fictional transactions were constructed to explain how hundreds of cattle, horses, and valuable goods had come into Mormon possession. The religious justification for this massive deception drew upon Mormon doctrines of divine revelation and prophetic authority. Community members were told that maintaining the false narrative was not merely self-preservation, but a religious duty necessary to protect the church and its mission. The massacre itself was reframed as a regrettable but necessary action taken in defense of the faith, while the subsequent cover-up was presented as protecting the broader Mormon community from persecution and destruction. This transformation of murder into martyrdom, of deception into devotion, represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the Mountain Meadows aftermath. The perpetrators and their accomplices convinced themselves that they were serving God by lying about their crimes. They created a theological framework that made dishonesty into righteousness and transformed their victims into threats that had justifiably been eliminated. The long-term success of this cover-up depended on the isolation of the Mormon community and their distrust of outside authority. Federal investigators were portrayed as enemies of the faith whose inquiries threatened the very survival of the Mormon people. Community members were taught that cooperating with these investigations would be tantamount to betraying their religion and endangering their eternal salvation. This isolation was reinforced through economic and social pressures that made cooperation with outside authorities almost impossible. Mormons who showed any inclination to tell the truth about the massacre found themselves ostracized from their community, cut off from economic opportunities, and subjected to social and religious sanctions that could destroy their lives and the lives of their families. The cover-up of the Mountain Meadows massacre ultimately became a defining characteristic of Mormon culture in Utah Territory, creating patterns of secrecy, insularity, and resistance to outside authority that would persist long after the specific details of the crime had faded from active memory. At dawn on the morning after the brutal executions, John D. Lee began to understand the true scope of what had unfolded at Mountain Meadows. The bodies of the emigrants lay scattered across the meadow where they had been gunned down and bludgeoned to death, their blood seeping into the Utah soil. What should have been a moment of reckoning instead became the beginning of one of the most elaborate cover-ups in American history, orchestrated by men who had convinced themselves they were doing God's work. The surviving children, 17 in total, all under the age of 8, huddled together in the Mormon wagons. These were the only witnesses left alive, spared because Isaac Haight and his conspirators believed they were too young to remember or testify about what they had seen. But the children had seen everything. They had watched their parents murdered by men they would later recognize wearing their mother's jewelry and riding their father's horses. As the sun rose on September 12, 1857, the magnitude of what the Mormon militia had done began to sink in. They had not simply killed a wagon train of emigrants, they had massacred entire families under a flag of truce. They had violated every principle of warfare, Christianity, and basic human decency. The realization should have brought horror and repentance. Instead, it brought calculation and conspiracy. John D. Lee would later describe the scene in his confession 20 years after the fact. The bodies were hastily stripped of valuables and clothing. Jewelry was pocketed, money was counted, and livestock was divided among the participants. The wagons were ransacked for anything of value. What couldn't be immediately divided was taken to Cedar City to be sold or distributed among the Mormon community. The emigrants' property, paid for with their blood, became the spoils of holy war. But the physical evidence of the crime was only part of the problem facing Isaac Haight and his fellow conspirators. They had acted without explicit authorization from Brigham Young, though they had certainly acted within the spirit of his martial law proclamation and his inflammatory rhetoric about destroying enemies of the faith. Now they needed to ensure that their version of events would be the only one that survived. The cover-up began immediately and operated on multiple levels simultaneously. First was the physical destruction of evidence. The bodies were thrown into shallow graves, barely covered with rocks and dirt. Personal effects that couldn't be easily sold or repurposed were buried or burned. The emigrants' weapons were distributed among the militia members or stored in Mormon armories. Even the location of the massacre was chosen partly because of its remoteness, making investigation difficult. Second was the construction of an alternative narrative that would deflect blame from the Mormon participants. This required careful coordination between multiple communities and dozens of participants. The story they settled on was both simple and elaborate. Paiute Indians, enraged by the emigrants' poisoning of their water sources and insulting behavior, had attacked and destroyed the wagon train. The Mormons had arrived too late to prevent the massacre and had heroically rescued the surviving children from their Indian captors. This narrative required the cooperation of the Paiute tribes in the region, and Isaac Haight began immediately working to secure their silence through a combination of bribes, threats, and promises of future protection. Some Paiutes had indeed participated in the initial attack, lured by promises of loot and convinced that they were helping their Mormon allies against enemies. But their role had been secondary, and many Paiute leaders were horrified when they learned the full extent of what had occurred. Chief Kenosh of the Pavant band, who had generally maintained good relations with the Mormons, was approached by Mormon leaders seeking his cooperation in maintaining the fiction of Paiute responsibility. According to later testimony, Kenosh was told that if he didn't support the Mormon version of events, his people would face retaliation from both the federal government and angry settlers seeking revenge for the massacre. The third element of the cover-up involved managing the information that reached Brigham Young and other senior church leaders in Salt Lake City. Isaac Haight sent carefully worded reports that downplayed Mormon involvement while emphasizing the threatening behavior of the emigrants and the spontaneous nature of the Indian attack. These reports were designed to provide Young with plausible deniability, while also suggesting that the massacre, however tragic, had been ultimately unavoidable. When Brigham Young's messenger finally arrived in Cedar City with instructions to let the Baker-Fancher party pass unmolested, he found Isaac Haight waiting with a predetermined response. "The massacre has already occurred," Haight explained, "and has been carried out by Indians who couldn't be controlled." This version of events was immediately dispatched back to Salt Lake City, giving Young the foundation for his own response to federal inquiries. The psychological dimension of the cover-up was perhaps the most sophisticated and disturbing aspect of the conspiracy. The men who had participated in the massacre were bound together by their shared guilt and their shared commitment to protecting their community and their faith. John D. Lee, Isaac Haight, William Dame, and the dozens of other participants were told repeatedly that their actions had been necessary, righteous, and approved by God through his earthly representatives. This psychological manipulation was reinforced through religious rhetoric that portrayed the emigrants as enemies of God's chosen people. The Baker-Fancher party was described in increasingly demonic terms, with stories circulating about their alleged crimes against Mormon women, their poisoning of water sources, and their threats against Mormon communities. These stories grew more elaborate with each telling, creating a mythology that justified the massacre in the minds of the participants. The children who had survived the massacre presented a particular challenge for the cover-up. They were living witnesses to the truth, and as they grew older, their memories and testimony could potentially expose the entire conspiracy. The Mormon families who took in these children were carefully selected for their loyalty and their ability to manage the information the children might possess or share. Some of the children were separated from their siblings and placed with families in different communities, making it difficult for them to corroborate each other's memories. They were given new names, told new stories about their origins, and gradually indoctrinated into Mormon beliefs and culture. When they asked about their parents or their past, they were told that their families had been killed by Indians and that they should be grateful to their Mormon rescuers for saving them. But children's memories proved more resilient than the conspirators had anticipated. The younger survivors retained clear recollections of the massacre, and they recognized their families' possessions in the homes of their Mormon guardians. They remembered their mother's jewelry, their father's clothing, and even specific details about the massacre itself. These memories would later prove crucial when federal investigators finally arrived to examine the crime. The cover-up also required the active participation of the broader Mormon community in southern Utah. Hundreds of people knew or suspected the truth about what had happened at Mountain Meadows, but they remained silent out of loyalty to their faith, fear of retribution, or genuine belief that the massacre had been justified. This wall of silence was maintained through a combination of religious authority, community pressure, and the shared understanding that exposure of the truth would bring disaster upon the entire Mormon settlement in Utah. Church leaders reinforced this silence through sermons that emphasized the importance of loyalty to the community and the dangers posed by outside investigators. Members were reminded of the persecutions the Mormons had faced in Missouri and Illinois, and they were told that federal authorities were looking for any excuse to destroy their religion and scatter their people. In this context, protecting the truth about Mountain Meadows became a religious duty. The effectiveness of this cover-up was demonstrated when the first federal investigators arrived in Utah Territory. Major James Henry Carleton, who led the initial investigation, found a community that presented a united front of ignorance and misdirection. Witnesses claimed to know nothing about the massacre beyond what they had heard about Indian attacks. Physical evidence had been destroyed or hidden. The surviving children had been coached about what they should and shouldn't say to outsiders. Even when Carleton began to uncover evidence that contradicted the official Mormon narrative, he found it nearly impossible to get anyone to speak openly about what they knew. The few Mormons who might have been willing to cooperate were intimidated into silence, while Paiute witnesses were dismissed by federal authorities as unreliable. The investigation stalled, and Carleton was forced to conclude his inquiry with only circumstantial evidence of Mormon involvement. The cover-up might have succeeded permanently if not for the gradual breakdown of the psychological bonds that held the conspiracy together. As years passed and the immediate fear of federal retaliation faded, some participants began to experience what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress and moral injury. They had nightmares about the massacre, struggled with guilt and shame, and found it increasingly difficult to reconcile their actions with their religious beliefs. John D. Lee was among those most severely affected by this psychological deterioration. His multiple wives later described his erratic behavior, his violent outbursts, and his periods of deep depression. He began drinking heavily, despite Mormon prohibitions against alcohol, and he became increasingly paranoid about being betrayed by his fellow conspirators. His behavior became so erratic that he was eventually distanced from church leadership and sent to establish a ferry crossing on the Colorado River, effectively exiling him from the Mormon community. Other participants dealt with their guilt in different ways. Some threw themselves into religious activities, hoping to atone for their sins through increased devotion to the church. Others became bitter and cynical, losing their faith entirely but remaining trapped within the Mormon community by family ties and economic dependence. A few attempted to confess their involvement to church leaders, only to be told that their duty was to remain silent and trust in God's forgiveness. The most dangerous threat to the cover-up came from those participants who eventually left the Mormon faith entirely. These apostates no longer felt bound by religious loyalty or community pressure, and some were willing to speak openly about what they had witnessed or participated in. Philip Klingensmith was the most significant of these defectors, and his detailed testimony to federal authorities in the 1870s finally provided the evidence needed to bring prosecutions. But even as cracks began to appear in the wall of silence surrounding Mountain Meadows, the institutional cover-up continued to function effectively. Church leaders maintained their official position that the massacre had been carried out by Indians, with minimal Mormon involvement. When pressed by investigators or journalists, they expressed regret about the tragedy while continuing to deflect responsibility away from church members and leaders. This institutional denial was supported by a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to discredit critics and control the narrative about Mormon history. Church publications presented carefully edited versions of events that minimized Mormon culpability while emphasizing the hostile environment created by federal persecution. Academic historians who challenged the official Mormon narrative found their access to church archives restricted and their scholarship dismissed as biased or incomplete. The cover-up of the Mountain Meadows Massacre represents one of the most successful institutional conspiracies in American history, lasting for over 150 years before the LDS Church finally acknowledged full responsibility in 2007. This success was built on a foundation of religious authority, community solidarity, and the systematic suppression of dissenting voices. It demonstrates how powerful institutions can maintain false narratives for generations through the careful management of information and the manipulation of psychological and social pressures. The conspiracy also reveals the dark potential of religious extremism when combined with institutional power and isolation from external oversight. The men who planned and carried out the massacre were not monsters or criminals in the conventional sense. They were respected members of their community, fathers and husbands and church leaders who genuinely believed they were protecting their families and their faith. Their transformation into killers was facilitated by a religious culture that emphasized absolute obedience to authority and portrayed outsiders as existential threats to the community's survival. The cover-up itself became a form of continued violence against the victims and their families. For 150 years, the Baker Fancher Party was slandered as the authors of their own destruction, blamed for provoking the attack that killed them. Their surviving children were denied the truth about their family's fate and were forced to live with the psychological trauma of witnessing their parents' murders while being told they should be grateful to their killers. The Paiute tribes were falsely accused of the massacre and faced decades of suspicion and hostility as a result. Perhaps most tragically, the cover-up prevented the Mormon community itself from honestly confronting the implications of what had been done in their name. Instead of grappling with the moral and theological questions raised by the massacre, church members were encouraged to see themselves as victims of persecution and misunderstanding. This defensive posture made it virtually impossible for the community to engage in the kind of honest self-examination that might have prevented similar tragedies. The Mountain Meadows Massacre and its cover-up stand as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, religious extremism, and the human capacity for self-deception. They remind us that ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when they surrender their moral judgment to institutional authority and allow fear and prejudice to override their basic humanity. The conspiracy of silence that protected the perpetrators for so long demonstrates how communities can become trapped by their own lies, unable to acknowledge the truth without destroying the foundations of their identity and beliefs. Most importantly, the Mountain Meadows cover-up illustrates the corrosive effects of institutional dishonesty on both the perpetrators and the victims of historical trauma. The lies told to protect the Mormon community ultimately poisoned it, creating generations of cognitive dissonance and moral confusion. The truth, when it finally emerged, was far more damaging to the church's reputation than honest acknowledgement might have been in 1857. As dawn broke on September 12, 1857, the true horror of what had transpired at Mountain Meadows began to sink in among the Mormon militia members who had carried out the massacre. The bodies of approximately 120 men, women, and children lay scattered across the meadow, their blood soaking into the Utah soil. What followed in the immediate aftermath would prove almost as disturbing as the killings themselves, as the perpetrators launched into a systematic campaign of cover-up and deception that would persist for decades. John D. Lee, who had orchestrated the final betrayal under the flag of truce, immediately took charge of the cleanup operation. The bodies were hastily stripped of all valuables, jewelry, clothing, and personal effects. Wagons were searched and looted, with everything of value divided among the Mormon participants. The livestock, including hundreds of cattle and horses, were driven away to be sold or integrated into Mormon herds. Even the weapons surrendered by the victims were collected and distributed among the militia members. The burial of the victims was conducted with shocking callousness. Rather than providing proper Christian burials, the bodies were dragged to shallow depressions and covered with minimal dirt and rocks. Some accounts suggest that many bodies were left so poorly buried that wolves and other scavengers later scattered the remains across the meadow. This desecration of the dead would become a source of particular outrage when federal investigators arrived years later to examine the scene. Most disturbing was the fate of the 17 surviving children, all under the age of 8. These traumatized orphans, who had witnessed the slaughter of their families, were distributed among Mormon families throughout southern Utah. The militia leaders had spared them not out of mercy, but because they believed children so young could not provide credible testimony about what they had witnessed. However, this calculation would prove catastrophically wrong. The children retained vivid memories of the massacre and could identify many of the perpetrators. Even more damning, they recognized their deceased parents' belongings, particularly jewelry and clothing, being worn by their Mormon caretakers. They could identify their father's horses, which bore distinctive brands, grazing in Mormon pastures. These living witnesses would eventually provide crucial evidence that would unravel the carefully constructed lies about Paiute responsibility for the massacre. Isaac C. Haight and William H. Dame, the senior militia commanders who had authorized the attack, immediately began crafting the narrative that would become the official Mormon version of events. They convened meetings with all participants, swearing them to absolute secrecy about Mormon involvement. Any mention of the truth, they warned, would bring federal retaliation that could destroy the entire Mormon community in Utah. The story they constructed was elaborate and detailed. Paiute warriors, enraged by the Baker-Fancher Party's alleged poisoning of water sources, had attacked and annihilated the wagon train in revenge for the deaths of tribal members. To make this fabrication credible, the Mormon leaders needed to establish a clear motive for Paiute hostility. They began spreading increasingly lurid tales about the Baker-Fancher Party's behavior during their journey through Utah. According to these invented stories, the emigrants had not only poisoned water sources but had also insulted Mormon women, desecrated Mormon graves, and boasted about participating in the persecution of Mormons in Missouri and Illinois. None of these allegations had any basis in fact, but they served to create a narrative framework that justified both Paiute anger and Mormon inability to protect the emigrants. The poisoned water story became particularly central to the cover-up. Mormon leaders claimed that members of the Baker-Fancher Party had deliberately contaminated springs and streams with arsenic or other toxins, causing the deaths of both Paiute people and Mormon livestock. This allegedly prompted the Paiute attack as an act of justified revenge. However, when federal investigators later examined these claims, they found no evidence of water contamination, no reports of unusual deaths among local populations, and no corroboration from Paiute leaders who consistently denied their people's involvement in the massacre. The Mormon leadership's challenge was not merely local but territorial and national. Brigham Young, as territorial governor, would inevitably face questions about such a significant incident occurring under his jurisdiction. The official reports sent to Young described a tragic but unavoidable conflict between immigrants and Native Americans, with Mormon settlers powerless to intervene due to their own precarious military situation with federal troops approaching Utah. Young's response to these reports has remained a subject of historical debate. Some evidence suggests he may have sent word to leave the Baker-Fancher Party alone, but this message allegedly arrived too late to prevent the massacre. More controversially, some historians argue that Young's inflammatory rhetoric about outsiders and his declaration of martial law created the climate of paranoia and hostility that made the massacre possible, even if he did not explicitly order the killings. The cover-up required not just the silence of the direct participants, but the complicity of the broader Mormon community in southern Utah. Hundreds of people knew or suspected the truth about Mormon involvement, but the combination of religious loyalty, fear of federal retaliation, and social pressure maintained a wall of silence that would persist for decades. This collective conspiracy of silence was enforced through the Mormon concept of blood atonement, which suggested that some sins were so serious they could only be forgiven through the shedding of the sinner's blood. Speaking out about the massacre, leaders warned, would constitute such a sin. The disposal of evidence became an ongoing concern for the perpetrators. Beyond the physical evidence at the massacre site, there were the personal belongings of the victims that had been distributed throughout the Mormon community. Jewelry, clothing, weapons, and household goods that had belonged to the Baker-Fancher families were now in Mormon homes, creating a trail of incriminating evidence. Some items were hidden or destroyed, but many remained in circulation, creating ongoing risks of discovery. The 17 surviving children posed the greatest long-term threat to the cover-up. As they grew older and their memories remained clear, they became increasingly dangerous witnesses. Some Mormon families attempted to suppress the children's memories through intimidation or by forbidding them to speak about their experiences. Others tried to convince the children that their memories were dreams or fantasies. However, the children's consistent and detailed recollections of the massacre, combined with their ability to identify stolen property, made them invaluable witnesses when federal investigators finally arrived. The broader Mormon community's reaction to the massacre was complex and varied. While the official church position supported the Paiute story, Many individual Mormons were horrified by what had occurred and struggled with their knowledge of the truth. Some left the church entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with the actions of their leaders. Others remained but lived with profound guilt and anxiety about their community's complicity in mass murder. The psychological impact on the direct participants was severe and lasting. Many of the militia members who had carried out the killings suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and overwhelming guilt. Some turned to alcohol or other destructive behaviors to cope with their memories. A few attempted to confess their roles to religious or civil authorities, but were typically silenced through threats or bribes. John D. Lee, as the field commander who had personally orchestrated the final betrayal, bore a particularly heavy psychological burden. Contemporary accounts describe him as becoming increasingly erratic and paranoid in the years following the massacre, convinced that he was being watched and that his life was in danger. His later flight to Arizona and establishment of Lee's Ferry at a remote Colorado River crossing reflected his desire to escape not just legal consequences, but the psychological weight of his actions. The cover-up also required the creation of false documentation to support the official narrative. Church records were altered or destroyed to eliminate evidence of militia involvement. New documents were created to support claims about Paiute hostility and emigrant misconduct. Letters and reports were backdated to create paper trails supporting the fabricated timeline of events. This systematic falsification of records would later complicate efforts by historians and investigators to reconstruct the true sequence of events. The involvement of Paiute tribal members in the actual attack, while minimal compared to Mormon participation, created additional complications for the cover-up. Some Paiute warriors had indeed participated in the initial assault, motivated by promises of loot and livestock rather than by any genuine grievance against the emigrants. However, Paiute leaders consistently maintained that their people had been recruited and directed by Mormon militia members, rather than acting independently. This partial Paiute involvement allowed Mormon leaders to construct a cover story that contained enough truth to be superficially credible. They could point to actual Paiute participation while concealing the extent of Mormon planning and leadership. However, this strategy also created vulnerabilities, as Paiute witnesses could potentially contradict the Mormon version of events if properly questioned by federal investigators. The massacre's aftermath also revealed the extent to which the Mormon community in southern Utah had become militarized and radicalized by 1857. The ease with which religious leaders could mobilize armed men to commit mass murder demonstrated how completely Brigham Young's rhetoric about defending Zion against Gentile enemies had been internalized by his followers. The Mormon Reformation of 1856-1857 had created a climate where extreme violence against outsiders could be justified as religious duty. The economic benefits derived from the massacre also helped ensure continued silence among the Mormon community. The stolen livestock, estimated to be worth tens of thousands of dollars, significantly enriched many Mormon families in southern Utah. The weapons, tools, and household goods taken from the wagon train were distributed throughout the community, creating a network of beneficiaries who had strong incentives to maintain the cover-up. This economic complicity made the massacre not just a crime committed by a few extremists, but a community-wide conspiracy. As weeks and months passed after the massacre, the cover-up became increasingly elaborate and institutionalized. Church authorities in Salt Lake City were briefed on the official version of events and instructed to maintain consistency in their public statements. Federal officials were fed carefully crafted reports that supported the Paiute narrative while deflecting attention from Mormon involvement. The territorial government, controlled by Mormon officials, conducted perfunctory investigations that inevitably concluded that Native Americans were solely responsible for the tragedy. The approaching federal investigation, delayed by the Utah War and other national priorities, created ongoing anxiety among the conspirators. As months stretched into years, some participants began to crack under the psychological pressure. A few attempted to leave Utah territory entirely, seeking to escape both legal consequences and the weight of their guilty knowledge. Others turned to religious extremism, convincing themselves that their actions had been divinely sanctioned and that their suffering was a test of faith. The cover-up of the Mountain Meadows Massacre represents one of the most successful large-scale conspiracies in American history, maintaining its essential elements for nearly 2 decades despite involving hundreds of participants and witnesses. This success was achieved through a combination of religious authority, community pressure, economic incentives, and genuine fear of federal retaliation. However, the psychological and moral costs of maintaining this deception would ultimately prove devastating to many of those involved, creating wounds in the Mormon community that would take generations to heal. The elaborate nature of the cover-up also demonstrated the institutional power of the Mormon Church in territorial Utah and its ability to control information and shape narratives even in the face of federal authority. This capacity for collective deception would have lasting implications for Mormon relations with the federal government and would contribute to ongoing tensions that would persist well into the 20th century. The decades following the Mountain Meadows Massacre revealed the true scope of the horror that had unfolded in that remote Utah valley. As federal investigators pieced together the evidence and survivors came forward with their testimonies, a disturbing picture emerged of systematic deception, institutional cover-up, and the lengths to which religious authorities would go to protect their reputation. The immediate aftermath of the massacre saw Mormon leaders scrambling to control the narrative. Within hours of the killing, Isaac Haight and John D. Lee had begun implementing what appeared to be a carefully planned cover-up operation. The bodies of the victims were hastily buried in shallow graves, their possessions distributed among local Mormon families, and their livestock integrated into church herds. Most critically, all participants were sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of excommunication and worse. But the 17 surviving children presented a unique challenge. Too young to be killed without raising suspicions, yet old enough to potentially remember details of the massacre, they became both witnesses and evidence of the crime. The Mormon families who took them in were instructed to treat them as their own children, but reports from federal investigators who later rescued these children painted a disturbing picture of neglect and psychological manipulation. Major James Henry Carleton, who led the federal investigation beginning in 1859, documented the condition of these child survivors with meticulous detail. Many showed signs of severe malnutrition and trauma. More damning still, they consistently identified personal belongings of their murdered parents being worn or used by their Mormon guardians. Wedding rings, watches, and distinctive clothing were found in the possession of the very people claiming to have rescued these children from Indian attacks. The children's testimonies, though fragmentary due to their young age at the time of the massacre, consistently contradicted the official Mormon narrative. Several remembered white men among their attackers, not just Paiute Indians. Some recalled being told by their captors that their parents had been bad people who deserved to die. These accounts provided investigators with crucial evidence that the massacre had been perpetrated by Mormons, not by Indians acting alone. Meanwhile, the broader Mormon community was being systematically indoctrinated with the false narrative that would persist for generations. Church leaders held special meetings where the official story was reinforced. The Baker Fancher Party had been hostile outsiders who had poisoned water sources and insulted Mormon women. The Paiute Indians, rightfully angered by these provocations, had attacked the wagon train. Mormon militia members had arrived too late to prevent the massacre and had only managed to save the youngest children. This narrative was supported by fabricated evidence and coached witnesses. Stories were circulated about members of the wagon train bragging about participating in the persecution of Mormons in Missouri and Illinois. Claims were made that they had been traveling with the explicit intention of joining federal troops in attacking Mormon settlements. None of these allegations were ever substantiated, but they served their purpose of justifying the massacre in the minds of faithful Mormons. The cover-up extended far beyond simple lies and misdirection. Physical evidence was systematically destroyed or altered. The massacre site was repeatedly disturbed to prevent proper investigation. Bodies were moved, personal effects were hidden or destroyed, and any documentation that might implicate Mormon leaders was burned or buried. When Major Carlton arrived to investigate, he found that much of the physical evidence had been compromised. Perhaps most insidiously, the Mormon leadership used the massacre to reinforce their broader narrative of persecution and divine protection. The attack was portrayed as evidence of the hostile world that surrounded the faithful, justifying increased isolation and dependence on church authority. Members were told that only by maintaining absolute loyalty to their leaders could they avoid similar fates. The massacre became not a source of shame, but a rallying cry for continued resistance to outside authority. This psychological manipulation was particularly effective because it built upon genuine grievances and fears. Mormons had indeed faced persecution in Missouri and Illinois. Their founder had been murdered by a mob. Federal troops were indeed marching toward Utah territory. These real threats made the fabricated threat seem plausible, and the extreme response seemed justified. The economic incentives for maintaining the cover-up were also significant. The property seized from the massacre victims represented substantial wealth that had been distributed throughout the Mormon community. Acknowledging the truth would have required returning stolen goods and potentially paying reparations to the victims' families. The financial stakes gave many community members a vested interest in maintaining the deception. As years passed and the immediate danger of federal prosecution seemed to fade, some participants began to experience what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress and guilt. Several Mormon men who had participated in the massacre reportedly suffered from nightmares, depression, and what was then called nervous exhaustion. Some turned to alcohol, despite their faith's prohibition against it. Others became increasingly isolated and paranoid. These psychological casualties of the cover-up created additional security risks for the conspiracy. Men struggling with guilt were potential weak links who might confess or provide information to investigators. This led to increased surveillance and intimidation within the Mormon community. Neighbors were encouraged to report any signs of wavering faith or suspicious behavior. The climate of fear that had enabled the massacre now worked to protect those responsible for it. The role of women in maintaining the cover-up was particularly complex. Mormon women who had received clothing, jewelry, and household items from the massacre victims were essential to sustaining the deception. They wore the dead women's dresses to church services, used their kitchen implements to prepare meals, and raised their orphan children as their own. Yet many of these women also struggled with the moral implications of their participation. Some women attempted to ease their consciences by treating the surviving children well, despite official instructions to integrate them fully into Mormon families and suppress their memories of their original parents. Others found ways to preserve small mementos or keepsakes that might someday be returned to the children's relatives. These small acts of conscience created additional evidence trails that would later prove valuable to investigators. The massacre also had profound effects on the Paiute tribes who were falsely blamed for the atrocity. Federal investigators quickly determined that local Paiute bands lacked both the motivation and the capability to carry out such a coordinated attack. Tribal leaders vehemently denied involvement and provided alibis for their warriors' whereabouts during the time of the massacre. The false accusations created lasting tensions between the Paiutes and federal authorities, who initially accepted Mormon claims about Indian responsibility. This led to increased military patrols in Paiute territory, restrictions on tribal movements, and demands for the surrender of supposed perpetrators who did not exist. The Paiutes found themselves punished for crimes they had not committed while the actual perpetrators lived freely among their Mormon neighbors. Some Paiute leaders attempted to provide information to federal investigators about Mormon involvement in the massacre, but their testimonies were initially dismissed or ignored. The racial prejudices of the era made it easier for authorities to believe that Indians were capable of such brutality than to accept that white Christian settlers had committed mass murder. This institutional racism became another layer of protection for the Mormon cover-up. As the 1860s progressed and the Civil War diverted federal attention from Utah territory, the Mormon leadership began to believe they had successfully buried the truth of Mountain Meadows. The massacre had receded from national headlines, the surviving children had been returned to their relatives in Arkansas, and the main federal investigators had been reassigned to other duties. Church leaders began to speak of the incident as a closed chapter, a regrettable but necessary action taken in defense of their community. This complacency would prove premature. The truth of Mountain Meadows was too large and involved too many people to remain hidden indefinitely. As participants aged and faced their own mortality, some began to reconsider their silence. The psychological burden of carrying such a terrible secret for decades proved too much for some to bear, and federal authorities, while distracted by other crises, had not forgotten about the massacre or abandoned their pursuit of justice. The stage was being set for the eventual unraveling of the conspiracy, though it would take another decade before the full truth began to emerge. The decades following the Mountain Meadows massacre witnessed a systematic campaign of concealment and denial that would persist for over a century, revealing how communities can transform collective guilt into institutional mythology through carefully constructed narratives, strategic silence, and the manipulation of historical memory. In the immediate aftermath of the September 1857 killings, Mormon leadership faced an unprecedented crisis of legitimacy. The massacre had claimed the lives of approximately 120 innocent immigrants, leaving only 17 children as witnesses to an atrocity that threatened to expose the dark underbelly of their religious community. The challenge was not merely legal, but existential. How could a people who claimed divine guidance explain away mass murder committed in their name? The first phase of the cover-up began within hours of the massacre itself. John D. Lee, Isaac Haight, and other militia leaders gathered the surviving participants and administered what they called a sacred oath of silence. This wasn't simply an agreement to keep quiet, but a religious covenant that transformed secrecy into a spiritual duty. Participants were told that breaking this oath would damn their souls and endanger the entire Mormon community. The massacre was reframed not as a crime, but as a necessary sacrifice to protect God's chosen people from federal persecution. Brigham Young's response to the crisis demonstrated the sophisticated nature of Mormon institutional thinking. Rather than conducting a genuine investigation, Young appointed George A. Smith, one of the very leaders whose inflammatory rhetoric had contributed to the massacre's climate, to lead the inquiry. This was not incompetence but calculation. Smith's predetermined conclusion that Paiute Indians were responsible served multiple purposes. It deflected blame from Mormon leadership, eliminated the need for accountability, and created a narrative that could be maintained indefinitely. The creation of the Paiute blame narrative required extraordinary coordination and creativity. Church leaders fabricated detailed stories about the immigrants poisoning water sources, insulting Mormon women, and threatening violence against local communities. These lies were repeated so frequently and with such conviction that many Mormons came to believe them genuinely. The poisoned water story became particularly central to the mythology, providing a clear motive for why Indians would attack the wagon train. But the most insidious aspect of the cover-up was how it exploited the 17 surviving children. These orphans, ranging in age from infancy to 6 years old, had witnessed the massacre and could potentially identify the perpetrators. Rather than treating them as precious survivors deserving protection and care, Mormon families who took them in often subjected them to neglect and abuse. When federal investigators finally arrived to collect the children in 1859, many reported finding them in deplorable conditions, dressed in rags and showing signs of malnutrition. The children's testimonies provided devastating evidence of Mormon guilt. They recognized their mother's jewelry being worn by Mormon women and identified their father's branded livestock in Mormon corrals. Some could even point out specific individuals who had participated in the killings. This eyewitness testimony from innocent children made the official Paiute narrative increasingly untenable, but Mormon leaders simply dismissed their accounts as the confused memories of traumatized youngsters. Federal investigations in the late 1850s and early 1860s uncovered overwhelming evidence of Mormon orchestration. Major James Henry Carleton's meticulous examination of the massacre site revealed that the killings had been carried out with military precision, not the chaotic violence typical of Indian raids. The positioning of bodies, the nature of wounds, and the systematic looting all pointed to organized militia action rather than spontaneous tribal revenge. Yet even as evidence mounted, the Mormon community's response demonstrated the power of collective denial. Rather than acknowledging the truth, they doubled down on their fabricated narrative. Church newspapers published elaborate accounts of Paiute savagery, complete with fictional details about Indian war councils and revenge ceremonies. These stories were distributed throughout Mormon settlements, creating a shared false memory that became more real to believers than the actual events. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the limitations of frontier justice when confronted with organized community resistance. While arrest warrants were issued for the primary perpetrators, most fled the territory with apparent advance warning. The few who remained, like John D. Lee, found themselves protected by networks of silence that extended throughout Mormon society. Potential witnesses refused to testify, evidence mysteriously disappeared, and entire communities developed collective amnesia about events they had previously discussed openly. The Civil War provided Mormon leaders with an unexpected reprieve. Federal attention turned to more pressing matters, and the isolated Utah territory became even more insular. During this period, the massacre narrative underwent further refinement. Church historians began portraying the emigrants as anti-Mormon agitators who had brought their fate upon themselves through their hostility to the saints. This victim blaming became a central component of the official story, transforming the murdered families from innocent travelers into dangerous enemies of God's people. The economic dimensions of the cover-up were equally revealing. The massacre had netted substantial wealth for the Mormon community, including hundreds of cattle, valuable goods, and cash estimated at over $30,000. This plunder was distributed among church members, creating a financial incentive for maintaining silence. Families who had received property from the murdered emigrants had a vested interest in ensuring the true story never emerged. Perhaps most disturbing was how the massacre became integrated into Mormon theological thinking. Some church leaders privately taught that the killings represented a form of blood atonement, a controversial doctrine suggesting that certain sins could only be forgiven through the shedding of blood. Under this interpretation, the emigrants' alleged crimes against the Mormon people justified their execution as a form of divine justice. This theological framework allowed participants to view themselves not as murderers, but as instruments of God's will. The psychological impact on the Mormon community was profound and lasting. The massacre created a culture of secrecy that extended far beyond the specific events at Mountain Meadows. Church members learned that loyalty to the institution trumped individual conscience, that official narratives must be defended regardless of evidence, and that questioning church leadership was tantamount to apostasy. These lessons would shape Mormon culture for generations. When John D. Lee was finally arrested in 1874, 17 years after the massacre, his trial revealed the full extent of the institutional cover-up. Lee's defense was that he had been acting on orders from church leadership, including Brigham Young himself. While he couldn't prove direct authorization for the killings, his detailed testimony exposed the climate of religious extremism and federal paranoia that had made the massacre possible. The decision to execute Lee in 1877 at the massacre site itself was laden with symbolism. Church leaders portrayed his death as justice served, but Lee himself recognized it as scapegoating designed to protect higher authorities. Even in death, Lee served the institutional narrative by taking sole responsibility for decisions that had clearly involved extensive planning and coordination. The aftermath of Lee's execution marked the beginning of the massacre's transformation from recent history into distant mythology. Church historians began portraying the events as an isolated incident carried out by rogue individuals acting against official policy. This narrative ignored the extensive evidence of institutional involvement and the sophisticated cover-up that had protected the perpetrators for 2 decades. The late 19th century saw the emergence of competing narratives about Mountain Meadows. Federal investigators, gentle historians, and former Mormons published accounts that contradicted the official church version. These alternative narratives were systematically suppressed within Mormon communities through social pressure, economic sanctions, and religious discipline. Church members who expressed doubts about the official story found themselves marginalized or excommunicated. The geographical isolation of Utah Territory aided the cover-up significantly. With limited outside scrutiny and a population that was overwhelmingly Mormon, controlling information flow was relatively straightforward. Church leaders could maintain their version of events without constant challenge from external sources. This isolation also meant that the massacre remained largely unknown to the broader American public for decades. As the 20th century approached, the Mountain Meadows Massacre had been successfully transformed from a documented atrocity into a disputed historical event. The institutional machinery of denial had proven remarkably effective, creating layers of false narrative that obscured the truth for over a century. The massacre became a case study in how religious institutions can manipulate historical memory to protect their reputation and authority. The long-term consequences of this cover-up extended far beyond the specific events at Mountain Meadows. It established patterns of institutional behavior that would influence Mormon responses to controversial issues for generations. The church's handling of the massacre demonstrated that loyalty to the institution superseded individual conscience, that official narratives must be defended regardless of evidence, and that questioning church leadership was tantamount to apostasy. Most tragically, the cover-up perpetuated the suffering of the massacre's victims and their families. The murdered emigrants were denied justice, their children were denied the truth about their parents' deaths, and their descendants were denied acknowledgement of their loss. The Paiute tribes were falsely accused of crimes they didn't commit, suffering decades of undeserved suspicion and hostility from federal authorities and local communities. The Mountain Meadows Massacre and its cover-up reveal the dark potential that exists when religious authority combines with institutional self-interest to suppress truth and accountability. It demonstrates how communities can collectively participate in maintaining lies when those lies serve their perceived interests, and how the manipulation of historical memory can transform perpetrators into victims and victims into villains. This systematic campaign of concealment and denial would persist well into the 20th century, creating a template for institutional cover-ups that transcended religious boundaries. The truth about the Mountain Meadows Massacre is even darker than most people realize. While the official church narrative has evolved over the decades, the evidence reveals a systematic cover-up that lasted over 150 years, orchestrated at the highest levels of Mormon leadership. What happened in those Utah meadows wasn't just a tragic moment of religious extremism gone wrong. It was a carefully planned execution disguised as an Indian attack, followed by one of the most sophisticated institutional deceptions in American history. The aftermath of the massacre tells us everything we need to know about how deeply this conspiracy reached into the heart of the Mormon establishment. Within hours of the killings, church leaders were already crafting their false narrative. They didn't just blame the Paiute Indians for the attack. They created an entire mythology around it, complete with fabricated evidence and coached witnesses. The story they settled on was as elaborate as it was false. The Baker Fancher party had supposedly poisoned water sources, causing the deaths of several Paiute Indians who then sought revenge. This lie became gospel truth within Mormon communities, repeated so often and with such conviction that many believers never questioned its validity. But the cover-up went far beyond simple misdirection. Church leaders systematically destroyed evidence, relocated witnesses, and used their religious authority to ensure silence from anyone who knew the truth. John D. Lee, one of the key perpetrators, later testified that he was told the massacre had approval from the highest levels of church leadership. This wasn't the work of rogue local leaders acting independently. This was institutional decision-making that prioritized the church's reputation over justice for the victims. The sophistication of the deception becomes clear when you examine how thoroughly they controlled the narrative. They didn't just deny Mormon involvement. They actively promoted the Indian attack story, providing specific details about Paiute motivations and methods. They arranged for witnesses to corroborate their version of events. They even went so far as to negotiate with actual Paiute leaders, essentially bribing them to remain silent about Mormon involvement while taking the blame for crimes they didn't commit. Perhaps most disturbing was how they handled the surviving children. 17 children under the age of 6 were spared, supposedly because they were too young to remember or identify the killers. But these children became living evidence of Mormon guilt. They recognized their mother's jewelry being worn by Mormon women. They identified their father's branded horses in Mormon stables. Their testimonies, when federal investigators finally reached them years later, completely contradicted the official Mormon narrative. Yet for years, these children lived among the very people who had murdered their families, being told lies about how their parents died. The federal investigation that eventually uncovered the truth faced enormous obstacles. Mormon communities closed ranks, refusing to cooperate with outside authorities. Witnesses disappeared or suddenly developed convenient memory lapses. Physical evidence was tampered with or destroyed. The church used its considerable political influence to delay and obstruct the investigation at every turn. When arrest warrants were finally issued for the key perpetrators, most fled to remote areas where they could avoid capture, often with church assistance. The most revealing aspect of the cover-up was how it evolved over time. As external pressure mounted and evidence became harder to suppress, the church gradually shifted its story. First, it was entirely the work of Indians. Then, when that became untenable, it became Indians assisted by a few rogue Mormons acting without authority. Later still, it became local Mormon leaders who got carried away in the heat of the moment. Each revision was presented as a fuller revelation of the truth, when in reality it was just another layer of calculated deception. Brigham Young's role in this cover-up cannot be understated. Whether or not he directly ordered the massacre, his response afterward shows a man more concerned with protecting institutional power than seeking justice. He appointed George A. Smith to investigate the incident, despite Smith being complicit in creating the hostile environment that led to the massacre. The investigation was a sham from the beginning, designed to validate the predetermined conclusion that Indians were responsible. Young's public statements about the massacre consistently supported the false narrative, even when he likely knew the truth. The church's control over information was so complete that even many faithful Mormons genuinely believed the Indian attack story for generations. This wasn't just external propaganda. They convinced their own people that they were victims of persecution when investigators tried to uncover the truth. They framed federal efforts to solve the case as religious persecution, creating a siege mentality that made questioning the official story seem like an act of betrayal against the faith. The economic dimension of the cover-up reveals another layer of institutional complicity. The property stolen from the Baker Fancher party didn't just disappear. It was distributed among Mormon settlers, sold at church-sponsored auctions, and integrated into the local economy. Church leaders knew exactly where these goods went because they oversaw their distribution. The cattle, wagons, clothing, and personal effects of 120 murdered people became community assets, creating a web of complicity that gave hundreds of Mormons a financial stake in maintaining the cover-up. When John D. Lee was finally arrested and put on trial, the church's response was telling. Rather than supporting one of their own who had followed what he believed were orders from higher authority, they abandoned him completely. Lee became the designated scapegoat, sacrificed to protect more prominent leaders. His execution in 1877 was presented as justice served, when in reality it was just another layer of the cover-up. By executing Lee, the church could claim that the responsible party had been punished while protecting the broader network of conspirators. The institutional memory management was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire operation. The church didn't just suppress evidence. They actively created false historical records, forged documents, and planted misleading information in official archives. They understood that controlling the historical narrative was crucial to maintaining their deception across generations. The psychological manipulation involved in maintaining this cover-up for over a century is staggering. Church leaders had to look grieving families in the eye and lie about how their loved ones died. They had to conduct religious services while knowing they were protecting mass murderers. They had to teach principles of honesty and integrity while orchestrating one of the most elaborate deceptions in American history. This kind of institutional cognitive dissonance doesn't happen by accident. It requires systematic training in compartmentalization and a complete subordination of individual conscience to organizational loyalty. What makes the Mountain Meadows cover-up so significant in American history isn't just its scale or duration. It's what it reveals about how religious institutions can use their moral authority to suppress truth and manipulate public perception. The Mormon Church didn't just commit crimes. They used their position as a religious organization to claim victimhood when investigators tried to hold them accountable. They turned their followers into unwitting accomplices by convincing them that defending the church's version of events was a religious duty. The parallels to modern institutional cover-ups are impossible to ignore. The same techniques used by Mormon leaders in the 1860s appear again and again throughout history when powerful organizations try to suppress inconvenient truths, deny, deflect, destroy evidence, discredit accusers, delay investigations, and, when all else fails, sacrifice a few low-level perpetrators while protecting the institutional leadership. The Mountain Meadows case provides a textbook example of how these strategies work and why they're so effective. The church's eventual acknowledgement of responsibility in 2007 was presented as a moment of moral courage and institutional honesty. But even this apology was carefully crafted to minimize ongoing damage. It acknowledged Mormon involvement while still maintaining that local leaders acted without higher authorization. It expressed regret while avoiding specific admissions that might create legal liability. Even in confessing, the church continued to manage the narrative in ways that protected its interests. The 150-year cover-up of the Mountain Meadows Massacre stands as one of the most successful institutional deceptions in American history. It shows how religious authority can be weaponized to suppress truth, how communities can be manipulated into complicity, and how historical narratives can be controlled by those with sufficient power and determination. The massacre itself was a horrific crime, but the cover-up that followed reveals something even more disturbing about the capacity of institutions to corrupt the very people they claim to serve. The victims of Mountain Meadows were killed twice, first by the bullets and clubs of their attackers, and then by the systematic erasure of their true story from historical memory. For 150 years, their families were denied the truth about how they died. Their children were raised on lies about their parents' fate. Their legacy was buried under layers of institutional deception designed to protect the reputation of their killers. That might be the greatest tragedy of all. The Mountain Meadows Massacre stands as a stark reminder that the capacity for violence and deception exists within even the most devout communities when fear, paranoia, and unchecked authority converge. This tragic event of 1857, where Mormon settlers murdered over 120 innocent immigrants, reveals how religious extremism and isolation can transform ordinary people into perpetrators of unspeakable acts. Though it took 150 years for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to formally acknowledge responsibility and apologize, the massacre serves as an enduring lesson about the dangers of blind obedience to authority and the importance of holding all institutions accountable for their actions, regardless of their religious or moral claims. The blood spilled at Mountain Meadows reminds us that vigilance against extremism and the courage to speak truth to power remain essential safeguards for any civilized society.